When I arrived for the family summer trip, my son-in-law looked me dead in the eye and told me I was not going. He called me a disgrace to the family, right in front of the neighbors. I did not yell. I just smiled and said, "All right, have fun." The next week, when they came back from Lake Tahoe and realized their keys no longer worked, he called me 73 times. But before I tell you what I said when I finally answered, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect should never be taken for granted. My name is Jim Sullivan. I am 66 years old. For the last 4 years, ever since my wife passed away, I have lived quietly in the basement apartment of a sprawling suburban house. I wear faded denim jeans, scuffed work boots, and old flannel shirts. To the outside world, and more importantly to my son-in-law Tyler, I am just a broke, retired old man clinging to the coattails of my successful children. That Tuesday morning, the summer sun was already beating down on the pristine driveway. I walked up the concrete path carrying my old canvas duffel bag, packed and ready for the annual family trip to Lake Tahoe. It was a tradition my late wife and I started decades ago. Tyler was standing by the open trunk of his leased luxury SUV. He wore designer sunglasses and a polo shirt that probably cost more than my first car. When he saw me approaching, his jaw clenched. He slammed the trunk shut with a loud thud and stepped directly into my path, physically blocking me from the vehicle. "Jim," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" I paused, adjusting the heavy canvas strap on my shoulder. "I am ready for the trip, Tyler. The cabin is booked and paid for." Tyler let out a harsh, mocking laugh. It echoed in the quiet suburban street. "No, Jim, you are not going. We decided last night that it is best if you stay behind." I looked at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the joke to end. But his face was dead serious, his expression twisted into a sneer of absolute disdain. "You are an embarrassment, Jim," he continued, his voice rising loud enough for the neighbors walking their dog across the street to hear. "Look at you. You walk around in rags. You drive a truck that belongs in a junkyard. You smell like sawdust and old coffee. I have colleagues at the lake this week. Important people. Clients who expect a certain standard. I am not having my broke father-in-law trailing behind us looking like a charity case. You are a disgrace to our image." I felt a tight knot form in my chest. It was not from Tyler's words. Tyler was a vulture, a man obsessed with appearances, who built his life on credit and arrogance. I always knew that. The knot in my chest formed because the front door of the house opened and my daughter Megan walked out. Megan was the center of my universe. When her mother died, I let her and Tyler take the main floors of the house rent-free so they could build their future without the burden of a mortgage. I retreated to the basement to grieve and to give them the space a young married couple needs. I looked at her now, fully expecting her to reprimand her husband, to tell him to stop being so cruel to her own father. "Megan," I said softly, my voice carrying the weight of 1,000 memories. "Your mother and I started this Tahoe tradition when you were 5 years old." She stopped at the edge of the porch. She would not meet my eyes. She looked at the perfectly manicured lawn, then at her expensive manicure, looking anywhere but at my face. "Dad," she mumbled, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Tyler is right. You have been so needy lately. It is supposed to be a relaxing vacation for us to unwind. You will just slow us down. You will just complain about the prices of the restaurants and embarrass us in front of Tyler's partners. Just go back down to the basement where you belong. We will bring you back a souvenir." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. My own daughter. The little girl I had taught to ride a bike, the girl whose college tuition I paid in full, so she would never know the burden of student debt, was standing on the porch of the house I bought, telling me to go back to the basement. She was telling me that my perceived poverty was an inconvenience to her husband's fragile ego. She was discarding me like an old broken piece of furniture. The old Jim, the man who spent 40 years ruthlessly negotiating contracts and building a commercial real estate empire from the ground up, would have crushed Tyler where he stood. I could have destroyed him with a single sentence. But I did not yell. I did not argue. I did not defend my pride. I looked at Tyler's smug face, flushed with the arrogant thrill of putting an old man in his place. Then I looked at Megan, who was already turning her back on me to get into the passenger seat of the luxury car. I let out a slow, deep breath, letting the illusion of the family I thought I had dissipate into the hot summer air. I smiled. It was a calm, cold smile. "All right," I said smoothly, my voice completely devoid of anger. "Have fun." I turned around and walked back down the driveway. I did not look back. I listened to the heavy doors of the SUV slam shut. I listened to the engine roar to life. I watched their taillights disappear down the street, heading off to their luxury vacation paid for, with credit cards they could barely afford. I waited until the street was completely empty. Then I walked back up the driveway past the flower beds I had paid to have landscaped and unlocked the heavy oak front door. The house was dead quiet. Tyler and Megan honestly believed they owned this sprawling estate. They believed my quiet move to the basement was a permanent surrender of my assets and my authority. They assumed that because I drove an old truck and bought my groceries with discount coupons, my bank accounts were as empty as their moral compasses. What they did not know was that I never transferred the deed. The house belonged to Sullivan Holdings, a commercial real estate firm that I founded 35 years ago. The same firm that owned half the shopping plazas in the downtown district. The same firm that currently generated more revenue in a single month than Tyler's failing consulting business had made in the last 3 years. I walked into the grand kitchen. I poured myself a cup of black coffee. The pain of Megan's betrayal was still a sharp, bleeding wound, cutting deep into my chest. But the grief was quickly being replaced by a cold, calculated clarity. They wanted me to be a stranger. They wanted me out of their sight. They believed I was a useless old man who had nothing left to offer the world. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I dialed a number I had not called for personal business in a very long time. "Warren," I said. When my lawyer answered the phone on the second ring, "It is Jim. I need you to draft a formal 30-day eviction notice. I want it fast-tracked. No, it is not for a commercial tenant. It is for my own house." "Yes, you heard me correctly. And Warren, send a crew over here. I need every single lock on this property changed today." The game had begun. I stood in the kitchen long after my lawyer hung up the phone. The house was painfully quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a funeral. I looked at the marble countertops, the stainless steel appliances, the imported Italian tile. I had paid for all of it. I had worked 80-hour weeks in my 30s, sweating over blueprints and fighting zoning boards, so my daughter would never have to know the sting of poverty. And this was my reward, being treated like a stray dog on my own property. Within 2 hours, a large white moving truck pulled up the driveway. Warren was always efficient. 4 men in uniform shirts stepped out carrying stacks of flattened cardboard boxes and rolls of packing tape. The foreman, a burly man named Marcus, shook my hand. I told him the parameters. We were not destroying anything. We were conducting a professional, meticulous relocation. I led the crew upstairs to the master suite. Tyler and Megan had taken the largest room, of course. I stood in the doorway and watched the men begin to fold designer suits and expensive dresses. My eyes wandered to Tyler's nightstand. A stack of unpaid bills sat next to a solid gold watch. I picked up a credit card statement. The balance was staggering. Tyler was paying the minimum on a card maxed out at $40,000, mostly from expensive dinners, golf club memberships, and luxury vacations. He was drowning in a sea of his own arrogance. And my daughter, the girl I had taught to balance a checkbook by the time she was 12, was happily sinking right alongside him. I felt a fresh wave of disappointment wash over me. It was not just about the money. It was about the utter lack of respect for the value of hard work. They were living a lie, and they were using my foundation to prop it up. The movers worked with quiet precision. I supervised every step. I made sure Tyler's expensive golf clubs were wrapped in bubble wrap. I made sure Megan's crystal vases were padded and boxed with care. I was not a vindictive man by nature. I was a businessman. In business, you do not let emotion dictate your actions. You follow the law. You document everything. You leave no room for the other party to claim damages. By packing their belongings so carefully, I was stripping Tyler of any excuse to play the victim later. He would not be able to say the crazy old man destroyed his property. Every single designer shoe, every expensive watch, every piece of electronic equipment was cataloged, boxed, and sealed. As the rooms emptied out, the house began to breathe again. Stripped of Tyler's pretentious art and Megan's expensive rugs, the true bones of the property revealed themselves. It was a solid house built to last. It reminded me of my late wife, Martha. We had picked out the hardwood floors together. We had argued over the color of the trim. We had dreamed of a house filled with grandchildren and laughter. Instead, it had become a monument to Tyler's ego. I walked down the hall to the guest room, which Tyler had converted into his home office. His desk was littered with past due notices from collection agencies. He was not a successful consultant. He was a fraud playing dress-up. And he had the nerve to call me a disgrace. The sheer audacity of his insults echoed in my mind, but they no longer hurt. They only fueled my resolve. By late afternoon, the moving truck was loaded. I followed them in my old, reliable pickup truck to a premium storage facility across town. I had paid for 6 months of rent in advance in cash. The facility had climate control, 24-hour security, and gated access. I was treating their belongings better than they had ever treated me. I watched as the movers unloaded the boxes, stacking them neatly inside the large unit. I signed the rental agreement, putting the unit entirely in Tyler's name but keeping the only physical key. I paid the manager, tipped the movers generously, and stood alone in front of the closed metal door. Inside that unit was the entirety of Tyler and Megan's fake life. I drove back to the house as the sun began to set. The summer heat was finally breaking, leaving a cool breeze in its wake. The driveway was empty. The house was completely silent. I walked through the front door, and for the first time in 4 years, I did not head toward the basement stairs. I walked straight into the main living room. I sat down on the leather sofa that remained a piece I had bought with my first major real estate dividend. I looked around the empty space. It was not lonely. It was liberating. I had spent 4 years making myself small so they could feel big. I had hidden my wealth, my intelligence, and my authority because I thought that was what a supportive father was supposed to do. I thought my sacrifice would buy their love. Instead, it had only bought their contempt. But the cleanup was complete. The physical remnants of their disrespect were locked away in a storage facility miles from here, and the first phase of my silent correction was officially done. The sun had barely risen the next morning when a heavy commercial van pulled up the driveway. It was exactly 7 in the morning. I had made a call the previous evening to a commercial security firm I often used for my downtown properties. The owner knew me well. He knew I demanded discretion and speed. 2 men stepped out of the van carrying heavy tool belts and thick metal boxes. They did not ask questions. I instructed them to replace every single lock on the main house and the basement apartment. I walked with them from room to room. I listened to the sound of drills and heavy metal clanking against the solid oak doors. Each screech of a drill felt like a definitive end to an era. The old brass locks that Martha and I had chosen together were stripped away and dropped into a cardboard box. They were replaced by high-security commercial-grade deadbolts. These were not the kind of locks you could pick with a simple tool. They required a registered, specialized key, a key that only I possessed. It was a strange feeling watching the access to my own home be completely rewired. For years, I had left the doors unlocked. I had trusted the people living inside. That trust was gone now, replaced by solid steel and titanium pins. When the locksmith handed me the single heavy silver key, it felt cold against my palm. I slipped it into my pocket. By midday, another crew arrived. This was the technology team. Tyler always bragged about the smart home gadgets he bought, but he never actually invested in real security. I directed the technicians to install high-definition, wide-angle cameras at every possible entry point. We placed one above the front porch, one monitoring the back patio, and two covering the entire length of the driveway. I wanted no blind spots. I needed to see exactly what would happen when Tyler and Megan returned from their luxury vacation. The technicians set up a master control station in my basement office. I stood in front of the large monitor watching the crisp, clear feeds of my property. I could see the wind blowing through the oak trees. I could see the street beyond. It gave me an absolute sense of control. I was no longer the blind, naive father waiting for scraps of affection. I was the architect of my own domain. But cameras and locks were not enough. I needed a physical boundary. The house sat far back from the street, separated by a long, paved driveway. I had the security company install a heavy wrought iron electronic gate across the entrance. It was a project that took them the entire afternoon. They drilled deep into the concrete and wired the motor to the main house panel. When they finally tested it, the thick iron gates swung shut with a heavy, satisfying thud. The property was now a fortress. Nobody was getting in without my explicit permission. As the security crews packed up their vans and drove away, the reality of my actions settled over me. I was completely alone in a fortified mansion. The silence was absolute. I walked into the kitchen and made myself a fresh cup of black coffee. I sat at the island counter and waited. At exactly 4 p.m, a courier arrived at the newly installed front gate. I buzzed him in. He drove up the driveway and handed me a thick manila envelope from Warren. My lawyer had worked quickly. Inside was a formal, legally binding 30-day eviction notice. Because Tyler and Megan had never signed a lease because they had never paid a single dime in rent, they were legally classified as tenants at will. Warren had drafted the document with meticulous precision. It cited relevant state laws and clearly outlined their immediate removal from the premises. I pulled the crisp white paper from the envelope. I read the legal jargon carefully. It felt surreal to read the name of my own daughter on a document ordering her to vacate the property. A small part of my heart ached. I remembered her as a little girl running through the sprinklers in the backyard. I remembered Tyler when he first asked for her hand in marriage, full of promises and grand speeches. But those people did not exist anymore. They had been replaced by greedy, arrogant strangers who saw me as an inconvenience. I walked to the front door. The heavy oak felt solid under my hand. I stepped out onto the porch. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. I held the eviction notice against the polished wood of the front door. I took a roll of heavy-duty packing tape and secured the document firmly at eye level. I made sure it was perfectly straight. I smoothed out the edges so the wind could not tear it away. It was a simple white paper with black text, but it carried the weight of a monumental shift in our lives. It was the physical manifestation of my boundaries. It was a declaration that I was no longer willing to be disrespected, used, and discarded. I stepped back and looked at the door. The notice stood out starkly against the dark wood. Tyler would see it the moment he walked up the steps. He would read the legal terms. He would realize that the house he had treated as his personal kingdom belonged entirely to the man he had called a disgrace. I went back inside and locked the new deadbolt. The heavy click echoed through the empty hallway. I walked down to the basement office and sat in front of the security monitors. The gate was closed. The cameras were recording. The eviction notice was served. I poured myself another cup of coffee and settled into my chair. All I had to do now was wait for them to come home. A full 7 days passed in absolute tranquility. For the first time in years, the house felt entirely mine. I spent the week enjoying the profound silence that only true independence can bring. I woke up early every morning and brewed my black coffee just the way Martha used to make it. I walked through the empty rooms upstairs, feeling the solid hardwood floors beneath my boots. The lingering smell of expensive cologne and entitlement had finally aired out of the master suite. My basement office became my sanctuary. The wall of monitors I had installed glowed with crisp, high-definition feeds of my fortress. The heavy iron gate at the end of the driveway stood like a silent sentinel. I knew they would be back today. Tyler had a consulting seminar on Monday, and he never missed a chance to show off his fake tan. It was shortly after 2 in the afternoon when the perimeter alarm chimed a soft, gentle tone through the basement. I set my ceramic coffee mug on the desk and leaned closer to the center monitor. The silver luxury sport utility vehicle pulled off the main road and turned toward my property. I watched as the heavy tires rolled to a stop, just inches from the new wrought iron gate. Tyler pressed a button on his visor, expecting the path to magically clear for him, as it always had. The gate did not move. He pressed it again and then a third time. Even through the silent video feed, I could sense the exact moment his annoyance sparked. He put the vehicle in park and stepped out into the afternoon heat. Tyler looked terrible. His skin was burnt a painful shade of crimson from too many hours on a rented boat. He wore a wrinkled linen shirt, and his expensive sunglasses were pushed up on his forehead. He walked up to the iron bars and shook them violently. The heavy metal did not budge. Megan stepped out of the passenger side a moment later. She looked equally exhausted, dragging her oversized designer tote bag across the pavement. She stood next to her husband, pointing at the gate and gesturing wildly. I watched my daughter complain about the inconvenience, completely unaware that her entire reality had shifted. Tyler stormed back to the vehicle and pulled it roughly onto the grassy shoulder of the street. They would have to walk the long driveway on foot. It was a quarter-mile walk uphill to the front porch. I watched them trudge up the paved path, pulling 2 heavy rolling suitcases behind them. The small plastic wheels bounced and clattered over the concrete joints. Sweat poured down Tyler's face. He was wiping his forehead with the back of his hand, his posture completely stripped of its usual arrogance. Megan trailed behind him, struggling with her bags, her face twisted in a scowl of pure misery. They looked exactly like what they were. 2 spoiled adults throwing a silent tantrum because the world had dared to inconvenience them. I picked up my coffee mug and took a slow, warm sip. The bitter liquid tasted incredibly sweet. They finally reached the front steps. Tyler dropped his suitcase handle and marched up to the heavy oak door. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his key ring. He slid his old brass key toward the keyhole but stopped abruptly. Through the high-definition camera mounted directly above the porch, I had a perfect view of his face. His eyes narrowed. He leaned in closer, inspecting the heavy commercial-grade deadbolt that now occupied the space where the old lock used to be. He tried to force his key into the slot anyway. The metal scraped and slipped uselessly against the titanium core. He tried another key from his ring, completely ignoring the obvious reality staring him in the face. Megan reached the top of the stairs, dropping her bags with a heavy sigh. She asked him what was taking so long. I could read her lips perfectly through the monitor. Tyler turned to her, shaking his head and holding up his keys. He gestured toward the door, his face turning a deeper shade of red. He grabbed the handle and yanked it downward with all his remaining strength, but the door remained entirely solid. He slammed his fist against the wood. The loud thud vibrated through the audio feed, filling my quiet basement office. It was the sound of a man hitting a wall he could not buy or manipulate his way around. Tyler stepped back from the door, breathing heavily. He put his hands on his hips and looked around the porch, searching for an explanation. That was when he finally saw it. The bright white paper secured to the center of the door at perfect eye level. The formal 30-day eviction notice. He stepped closer, squinting against the harsh afternoon sun to read the bold black text. I watched his eyes scan the first few lines. The transformation was instantaneous. The arrogant annoyance melted away completely, replaced by a cold, sheer panic. His mouth fell open. He read the document again, stepping so close his nose almost touched the paper. Megan noticed the change in his posture. She walked up beside him and leaned in to read the document over his shoulder. I watched my daughter raise her hand to cover her mouth. Her eyes widened in absolute shock. She looked at Tyler, her face pale beneath her sunburn. She pointed at the paper, shaking her head in denial. Tyler ripped the document off the door, tearing the heavy packing tape with a loud ripping sound. He stared at the legal seal at the bottom of the page, holding the paper with trembling hands. They finally understood. They had no keys. They had no access. They had no home. Tyler began pacing across the porch. He was running his hands through his hair, muttering frantically. He looked at the manicured lawn he had claimed as his own. He looked at the new cameras tracking his every movement. He realized he was being watched. He looked directly into the lens above the door, his chest heaving. The illusion of his success was shattered, locked inside a storage unit across town, and blocked by a titanium deadbolt. I sat back in my armchair, crossing my legs and resting my hands on my lap. The silence of my fortress remained completely unbroken. The true cost of disrespect had finally come due. The glowing screen of my cell phone illuminated the dim corners of my basement office. The device vibrated against the polished wood of my desk, creating a low, continuous hum that filled the silence. Tyler was calling. I leaned forward in my leather chair and looked at the security monitor. Up on the front porch, Tyler held his phone pressed tightly to his ear. He was staring directly at the heavy oak door, as if he could magically unlock the new titanium deadbolts through the sheer force of his arrogance. I did not reach for my phone. I sat perfectly still and let the call go to voicemail. Less than 10 seconds later, the phone began to vibrate again. Tyler was not a man who understood the word no. He had spent his entire adult life manipulating people, bluffing his way through business deals, and relying on aggressive intimidation to get whatever he wanted. He assumed I was sitting in the basement throwing a pathetic tantrum. He thought I was just an emotional old man seeking attention. He had no idea that he was dealing with a veteran of commercial real estate who had orchestrated hostile corporate takeovers before Tyler was even born. The phone stopped ringing. Then it started again. Call number 3. Call number 4. Call number 5. I watched the security feed with a sense of clinical fascination. Tyler paced back and forth across the wide concrete porch. He was sweating heavily in the thick afternoon heat. His expensive linen shirt was soaked through, clinging to his back. He pointed at the heavy door and shouted something to Megan, but the audio feed only picked up the muffled, aggressive tone of his voice. Megan sat down on one of her expensive rolling suitcases and buried her face in her hands. She looked completely defeated. By the 15th call, Tyler started pacing faster. He walked to the edge of the porch and peered through the large living room windows. He pressed his face against the tinted glass, trying to see inside. He cupped his hands around his eyes to block out the sun. He saw nothing but empty space where his television and expensive leather sofas used to be. I watched his shoulders drop. He pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at the screen in disbelief before dialing my number again. Call number 20. The vibration of my phone became a steady rhythm in the quiet room. It was a metronome counting down the last moments of Tyler and his fabricated empire. Call number 30. Call number 40. I picked up my ceramic mug and finished the last cold drops of my black coffee. I felt absolutely no pity for the man sweating on my porch. I remembered the way he had blocked my path in the driveway. I remembered the sneer on his face when he called me a disgrace in front of my own neighbors. I remembered the cruel satisfaction in his eyes when he told me I was not welcome on a family vacation that I had started decades ago. Call number 50. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawn. The heat of the day was breaking, but Tyler was only growing more agitated. He kicked the side of a heavy stone planter near the stairs. He grabbed his own hair in frustration. He pointed his finger directly at the security camera mounted above the door and screamed. His mouth formed words of pure venom. He dialed my number again. He was acting like a cornered animal, realizing for the first time that the trap had snapped shut, and he had willingly walked right into it. Megan pulled her phone from her designer bag and tried to call me. I watched her number flash on my screen. Call number 61. I ignored it. She had stood by and agreed when Tyler told me to go back to the basement where I belonged. She had chosen her path, and now she had to walk it. She tried twice more before dropping her phone back into her bag and wiping tears from her sunburned face. Tyler yelled at her, waving his arms wildly. He snatched his own phone and resumed his frantic dialing. Call number 70. The sky was turning a bruised shade of purple and orange. Tyler was exhausted. He was leaning heavily against the wooden porch railing, staring at the eviction notice he had ripped from the door. He held the crumpled paper in his sweaty fist. The legal document was the only thing tethering him to reality. Call number 71. Call number 72. The vibration rattled my phone across the smooth surface of the desk, inching it closer to the edge. Then the screen lit up for the 73rd time. The continuous buzzing filled the air. I looked at the monitor. Tyler was slumped against the brick pillar of the house, looking completely broken. I decided he had waited long enough. I reached across the desk and picked up the phone. I pressed the green button and brought the device to my ear. I did not say a word. I just breathed quietly into the receiver. "Jim," he screamed, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fury. "Are you out of your mind? Open this door right now. Do you hear me? Open this door. You have no right to do this. I am calling the police. I am calling the cops right now, and I am having you arrested for breaking and entering. You cannot lock us out of our own home." I listened to his pathetic threats. He was grasping at straws, throwing legal terms around without having any idea what they meant. He was trying to bully his way out of a corner. I kept my eyes focused on the security monitor, watching him press the phone so hard against his ear that his knuckles turned white. "Tyler," I said. My voice was low, even, and completely calm. "Do not use that tone with me, Jim," he interrupted, shouting so loudly, the speaker on my phone distorted. "You are going to jail. You are a crazy old man, and you are going to jail for breaking and entering my property." I let him finish. I let the silence hang between us for a long, terrible moment. I watched him on the screen, waiting for my response. "Tyler," I said smoothly, "you cannot break and enter into a house that belongs entirely to you. Look at the paper in your hand. Read the legal seal at the bottom. This is my property. You have 30 days to collect your things from the storage unit. Do not call this number again." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button. I set the device gently back onto the desk. On the monitor, I watched Tyler slowly lower his phone. He stared blindly at the dark screen. He looked at the crumpled eviction notice in his hand. The truth finally settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He dropped to his knees on the hard concrete porch, completely, utterly defeated. I sat in the dim light of my basement office, watching the monitors. The sun had completely set, leaving the front porch bathed in the harsh white glow of the security lights. Tyler was still on his knees, but only for a moment. He scrambled to his feet, his face twisted into a mask of pure desperation. He pulled his phone from his pocket and began dialing frantically. I knew exactly who he was calling. He was dialing 911. He was about to play his favorite card. The victim. He paced the concrete porch, gesturing wildly as he spoke to the dispatcher. I could not hear the audio, but his body language told the entire story. He was pointing at the heavy oak door, pointing at the cameras, and running his hands through his sweaty hair. Megan sat on her suitcase, hugging her knees to her chest. She looked completely lost. She had married a man who promised her the world, but all he had delivered was a locked door and a crushed ego. I felt a brief pang of sorrow for my daughter, but I pushed it aside. The lesson had to be learned in full. 20 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser reflected off the wrought iron gate at the end of my driveway. I reached across my desk and pressed the button to open the electronic gate. The heavy metal doors swung inward, allowing the patrol car to enter my property. The cruiser rolled slowly up the long paved driveway, the tires crunching softly against the concrete. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle. They looked young, professional, and completely unaware of the dramatic performance Tyler was about to give them. Tyler practically threw himself down the porch steps to greet them. He immediately started waving his arms, pointing back up at the house. "Officer, thank God you are here," he shouted, his voice echoing clearly through the outdoor microphones. "My father-in-law has lost his mind. He is a squatter living in our basement, and he locked us out. He changed the locks while we were on vacation, and now he is holding our house hostage. You need to break that door down and arrest him right now. He is trespassing, and he is dangerous." The older of the two officers held up a hand, asking Tyler to calm down. "Sir, we cannot just break down a door," the officer explained patiently. "We need to assess the situation. Who exactly owns this property?" Tyler did not miss a beat. "We do," he lied smoothly, his voice dripping with arrogant confidence. "It is our house. He is just a guest who overstayed his welcome and lost his grip on reality. Please, you have to get him out of there." It was my cue. I picked up the thick manila folder resting on the corner of my desk. I had prepared this file exactly for this moment. I walked up the basement stairs, my boots heavy and deliberate against the wooden steps. I did not rush. I walked through the quiet, empty hallway of the main floor and stopped at the front door. I turned the heavy titanium deadbolt. The loud mechanical click silenced Tyler mid-sentence. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped out onto the porch. The cool evening air washed over my face. I looked down at the driveway. Tyler was standing next to the officers. His chest puffed out, an ugly smirk of triumph trying to form on his sunburned face. He actually thought he had won. He thought the police were his personal security force sent here to bully an old man back into the basement. "Good evening, officers," I said, my voice calm, deep, and completely steady. I walked down the steps holding the manila folder in my right hand. "I am Jim Sullivan. This is my property. I apologize that you had to be called out here tonight." Tyler took a step forward, pointing an accusing finger at my chest. "Do not listen to him," he yelled. "He is crazy. He is a squatter. Arrest him." The older officer placed a firm hand on Tyler's chest, stopping him from moving any closer. "Sir, step back and remain quiet," the officer commanded. I approached the officers and handed them the manila folder. "Gentlemen, I believe you will find everything you need right here," I said smoothly. "The first document is the original property deed registered to Sullivan Holdings. The second document is the legal trust proving that I am the sole owner and controller of that holding company. The house belongs entirely to me." I paused, letting the officers review the paperwork in the dim light of their flashlights. I then pointed toward Tyler, who was suddenly looking very pale. "The man yelling at you is my son-in-law," I continued. "He and my daughter have been living here rent-free for 4 years. They do not have a lease. They have never paid a single dime in rent or property taxes. They are legally classified as tenants at will." The third document in that folder is a copy of the formal 30-day eviction notice, which was legally served and posted on that front door. I also have video evidence of him destroying that legal notice when he arrived. The two officers read through the crisp legal documents. The paper trail was absolute. It was flawless. The older officer handed the folder back to me with a respectful nod. He turned his attention back to Tyler, and his demeanor had completely changed. The patient, helpful attitude was gone, replaced by the stern, hard look of a cop who realized he had just been lied to. "Sir," the officer said, his voice echoing sharply in the quiet night. "This man is the legal owner of the property. You have no lease and you have been served a lawful eviction notice. This is strictly a civil matter. We cannot force him to let you inside." Tyler opened his mouth to argue, but the officer cut him off immediately. "In fact, since the owner has explicitly stated you are no longer welcome inside the residence and has secured the premises, you have no legal right to try and force entry. If you attempt to bypass those locks or damage this property, we will arrest you for vandalism and trespassing." Tyler looked as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked at the police officers, then at the impenetrable house, and finally at me. The arrogant, successful consultant was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, humiliated man who had just been stripped of his false kingdom in front of the authorities. You need to gather your bags and vacate this property immediately, the younger officer instructed, gesturing toward the open iron gates at the bottom of the long driveway. Do not make us ask you again. Megan began to sob quietly, picking up the handle of her designer suitcase. She did not look at me. Tyler stood frozen for a long second before his shoulders completely slumped. He grabbed his bag and began the long, humiliating walk down the driveway, escorted by the flashing lights of the police cruiser. I watched my daughter walk away in the glow of the red and blue police lights. A part of my heart wanted to call out to her, to tell her she could stay if she left him. But I knew she would never respect me if I folded now. She needed to experience the real world without my invisible safety net, protecting her from the consequences of her choices. She needed to see the man she married for who he truly was, a man who would lie to the police just to save face. I stood on my porch and watched them leave, knowing the real financial nightmare for him had only just begun. The morning after the police escorted my daughter and her husband off my property, I drove downtown to meet with my attorney, Warren Fisher. The city traffic was thick and slow, but I felt a strange and absolute sense of calm. The air in the cab of my old pickup truck smelled of aged leather and stale black coffee. I watched the towering skyscrapers of the financial district rise up against the morning sky. I owned a significant portion of the commercial real estate in this exact district. I had spent 40 years of my life ruthlessly negotiating contracts, navigating complex zoning laws, and building a silent empire from the ground up. I knew exactly how real wealth operated. True wealth was quiet and patient. It did not need to shout for attention. Tyler, on the other hand, was a man who believed wealth was a loud public performance. He was about to find out how incredibly expensive that performance truly was. I parked my truck in a subterranean garage and took the private elevator up to the 40th floor of a sleek glass high-rise. The building belonged to a rival firm, but Warren liked the panoramic view of the river. I stepped into the reception area wearing my usual faded jeans and a plain gray button-down shirt. The receptionist, an elegant young woman in a tailored suit, offered me sparkling water, but I politely declined. I was not there to socialize or relax. I was there to perform a financial autopsy on my son-in-law. Warren was waiting for me in his large corner office. He was a sharp and meticulous man in his early 60s, with thinning gray hair and a mind like a steel trap. We had worked together for over 20 years. He had helped me structure my holding companies and hide my assets after my wife Martha passed away. He knew my business philosophy inside and out. He knew I never acted out of blind emotion or petty revenge. I only acted on hard, verified data. I sat down in the heavy leather guest chair across from his massive mahogany desk. Warren did not offer any empty pleasantries. He knew exactly what kind of morning I was having. He simply reached into his bottom desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder, placing it squarely in the center of the desk. He leaned forward and folded his hands over the polished wood. He told me his private investigators had spent the last 48 hours digging deep into the financial reality of my son-in-law. Warren explained that people like Tyler always leave a massive paper trail of their own arrogance. They are so obsessed with projecting an image of success that they inevitably leave themselves entirely exposed to anyone willing to look at the actual numbers. I reached out and opened the folder. The first few pages detailed the current state of Tyler and his supposed elite consulting firm. I read the numbers carefully, letting the cold, hard facts wash over me. Tyler had always boasted about his high-profile clients and his massive revenue streams. He loved to stand in my kitchen and lecture me about modern wealth generation while sipping imported wine that he did not even buy. The documents in my hands told a completely different and pathetic story. His consulting firm was an absolute mirage. He had no major corporate clients. He had not secured a single lucrative contract in over 14 months. The luxury office space he rented downtown to impress his imaginary clients was 3 months behind on lease payments. The landlord was already preparing to file an eviction notice of their own. Tyler was surviving entirely on predatory high-interest business loans to maintain his illusion of success. He was drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of commercial debt. I turned the page and looked at his personal credit reports. The balances were staggering. He had leveraged every single line of credit available to him. He was paying exorbitant interest rates just to keep his luxury golf club memberships active. He was using cash advances from one credit card to pay the minimum balances on another. It was a classic and desperate shell game. I felt a brief moment of grim satisfaction, realizing that the man who had called me a broke charity case was actually on the verge of total financial collapse. But that satisfaction was quickly replaced by a cold and heavy sickness in my stomach. I looked up at Warren and asked him how a man this deep in debt was managing to pay for his luxury leased vehicle and the expensive vacation they had just taken to Lake Tahoe. Warren sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair. He told me to turn to the third section of the dossier. He warned me that the next part of the report was going to be very difficult to read as a father. I flipped past the credit reports and looked at the bank statements. I recognized the routing numbers immediately. It was a joint savings account I had set up for Megan on her 18th birthday. It was a private trust meant to be her emergency safety net. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table with my late wife, Martha, carefully transferring funds from our primary business accounts to build that fund. We had wanted to ensure our daughter would never find herself desperate or trapped in a bad situation. We wanted her to have the financial freedom to walk away from any job or any relationship that did not serve her well. I had worked through countless weekends and missed holidays early in my career just to have the liquidity to fund that specific account. We had deposited a substantial amount of money into it over the years, and then quietly stepped back, letting her manage it as an independent adult. I had not looked at the balance in almost 10 years, trusting that she was keeping it safe for her future. I stared at the withdrawal history and felt the breath leave my lungs. The balance, which should have been generating steady interest for years, was shockingly low. Tyler had convinced Megan to give him joint access to the account shortly after their wedding. He had likely claimed it was for investment purposes or to help grow their marital assets using his supposed financial expertise. The statements showed a systematic and ruthless draining of my daughter's future. Month after month, Tyler had been siphoning thousands of dollars from the safety net I had built for her. He was not investing it into mutual funds or real estate. He was bleeding the account dry to fund his fragile, massive ego. I saw the transaction records clearly tracking his movements across the city. He used the money from her safety net to pay for his custom-tailored suits, his luxury imported watches, and the premium dinners he used to impress his fake clients at high-end steakhouses. I even saw charges for imported cigars and exclusive wine clubs. He used the funds from her account to pay for the Lake Tahoe cabin rental and the expensive boat charter, the very same trip he had proudly and loudly banned me from attending. He was literally stealing from his wife to fund the facade of a successful man. The cold knot of anger in my chest pulled tighter, wrapping around my ribs like a steel cable. This was no longer just about a disrespectful son-in-law acting like a spoiled, arrogant child on my driveway. This was insidious, parasitic theft. He was draining my daughter's financial security while smiling in my face and telling me I was an embarrassment to their pristine image. The absolute betrayal of it made my vision blur for a fraction of a second. I thought about Megan standing on the porch, averting her eyes and telling me I was too needy and would only slow them down. She had defended a man who was actively robbing her blind. I wondered if she knew the extent of his theft, or if she was completely blinded by the charming lies he fed her every single night. I wondered if she had authorized the transfer for the vacation, knowing it was draining the money her mother and I bled for. Warren watched me process the information in absolute silence. He allowed me the time I needed to absorb the staggering magnitude of the betrayal. He was a professional who knew that a man digesting this kind of pain needed a moment of quiet dignity. The documents in front of me were not just financial records printed on crisp white paper. They were undeniable proof that the family I had tried to protect was entirely broken. The son-in-law I had tolerated out of love for my daughter was nothing more than a parasite feeding on her inherited security. I looked back at the first page of the dossier, seeing the names of the predatory lenders Tyler had borrowed from. They were not legitimate banks. They were aggressive commercial lenders who would inevitably come looking for their money, and they would look at my daughter as a secondary target to recover their losses. Tyler was not just failing, he was actively pulling Megan down into a dark and dangerous financial abyss. I closed the thick manila folder. I let my hand rest flat and heavy against the smooth cardboard cover. I felt the initial shock fade away completely, replaced by a cold, focused, and unyielding resolve. I had spent the last 4 years minimizing my existence so they could feel large and important. I had let them play house in my mansion while they squandered everything of real value. I had worn faded clothes and driven a rusty truck to give them the illusion that they were the successful ones in the family. I looked across the desk at my attorney. My voice was low and perfectly steady when I spoke. I asked Warren to prepare the paperwork for the absolute and immediate severing of all connected accounts. The time for passive observation was over. Tyler had built his entire false reality using my money and my daughter's security. I told Warren it was time to step out of the shadows and cut every single financial lifeline they had left. I sat alone in my basement office, surrounded by the soft glow of the security monitors. The house above me was completely silent. Tyler and Megan had been gone for almost 2 hours. My lawyer Warren had given me the dossier. I had read the bank statements. I knew exactly how my son-in-law had been draining my daughter's safety net to fund his illusion of a successful life. Now it was time to systematically dismantle that illusion. I opened my heavy oak desk drawer and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I flipped it open and watched the screen flicker to life. The first step was the easiest. I logged into my primary banking portal, the one I used to manage the family's major assets. The account dashboard loaded, showing a series of carefully structured trusts and checking accounts. I navigated to the automated payments section. There it was. A monthly recurring transfer of $1,200 for a luxury imported sport utility vehicle. The same vehicle Tyler had used to block my path in the driveway. He loved that car. He loved to show it off to his neighbors and his imaginary clients. He loved the way the leather smelled and the way the engine roared. But he did not love the car enough to actually pay for it. The lease was entirely in my name. I had co-signed it years ago as a favor when his credit was supposedly recovering from a bad business deal. I hovered the cursor over the cancellation button. I thought about the sneer on his face when he called me an embarrassment. I clicked the mouse. The screen refreshed, displaying a bright green confirmation message. The autopay was successfully severed. When the next payment cycle hit, Tyler would be entirely on his own, and the bank would not be lenient with a man who had zero legitimate income. Next, I opened the portal for the major credit card company. This was the account that truly made my blood boil. It was a high-limit premium card that I had given to Megan for emergencies. A few years ago, she had asked me to add Tyler as an authorized user so he could cover household repairs while he built his consulting firm. I had agreed, trusting my daughter. But the statements I reviewed with Warren showed Tyler was using it to fund his luxury lifestyle. He was paying for expensive dinners, imported wine, and custom suits on my dime. I clicked into the account management tab. The current balance was staggering. He had treated my credit line like his personal slush fund. I navigated to the authorized users section. Tyler's name sat there, smug and presumptuous. I clicked the button to remove him. A warning prompt popped up asking me to confirm the action. I did not hesitate. I confirmed the removal, effectively turning the piece of plastic in his expensive leather wallet into a useless piece of trash. Then I went a step further. I suspended the entire account. Megan would have to call me directly if she needed access. The free ride was officially over. The final step was the most painful. It was the joint savings account, the safety net I had built for Megan, with my late wife, Martha. I logged into the trust management system. This account was heavily protected, requiring multiple authentication steps. I verified my identity and accessed the dashboard. The balance stared back at me, a painful reminder of Tyler's parasitic theft. He had drained tens of thousands of dollars from my daughter's future. As the primary trustee, I had the authority to freeze the account entirely. It was a drastic measure, but it was the only way to stop the bleeding. If I left the account open, Tyler would continue to drain it down to the last penny to save his own skin. He was a desperate man drowning in debt, and desperate men do not stop taking until there is nothing left to take. I clicked the option to place a hard freeze on all outbound transfers. A small window popped up asking for a reason. I typed suspected fraudulent activity. I confirmed the freeze. The account was locked tight. Megan would not be able to withdraw a single cent without my direct authorization, and Tyler would never touch that money again. I leaned back in my leather chair and stared at the laptop screen. The entire process had taken less than 15 minutes. In that short amount of time, I had completely dismantled Tyler's financial facade. The luxury car was now a ticking time bomb. The credit cards were dead. The safety net he had been exploiting was locked behind a titanium digital wall. He was completely exposed. I closed the laptop and pushed it across the desk. The silence of the basement felt different now. It was no longer the silence of a man hiding from his own family. It was the silence of a man who had finally reclaimed his power. Tyler had tried to treat me like a disposable old man. He had tried to silence me, to push me into the shadows so he could pretend to be the king of a castle he did not own. But the king had returned, and the false prince was about to find out exactly how much his borrowed crown truly cost. The financial guillotine had dropped. Now all I had to do was wait for the blade to hit the block. I spent the next 48 hours in the quiet solitude of my basement office. I did not leave the property. I did not need to. The digital traps I had set were working perfectly silently, dismantling Tyler's entire reality. I kept one of the monitors tuned to the local news, and the other three displaying the crisp, unblinking feeds from the security cameras around my property. The heavy iron gate remained securely closed. No one had returned. They were out there somewhere in the city, trying to figure out how to survive without the safety net they had taken for granted. It was early Thursday morning when my lawyer Warren called. He had set up an alert system to track any legal or financial activity related to the accounts I had frozen. His voice was calm, but I could hear the underlying tension of a man who knew a storm was breaking. He told me that Tyler and Megan had checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour, a far cry from the luxury they were accustomed to. The credit card they had tried to use to pay for a better hotel had been declined thanks to the freeze I had placed on the joint account. They were running out of options, and they were running out of time. Warren also informed me that the bank had moved with surprising speed regarding the luxury SUV. Because Tyler had no legitimate income and no assets in his own name, he was considered a high-risk flight risk. The bank was not going to wait for a formal repossession process. They were taking immediate action to secure their asset. The lease was in my name, but the bank knew I had no intention of making the payments. They were coming for the vehicle. I imagined Tyler waking up in that motel room. The air probably smelled of stale smoke and cheap disinfectant. He would stretch, feeling the ache of sleeping on a lumpy mattress, a stark contrast to the custom orthopedist bed I had bought for the master suite. He would try to shake off the exhaustion, telling himself that this was just a temporary setback, a misunderstanding that he could somehow bluff his way out of. He would look at Megan sleeping restlessly beside him and feel the crushing weight of his own failure. He would get out of bed, careful not to wake her, and walk to the window. He would pull back the thin, faded curtain to look out at the parking lot. He would expect to see the gleaming silver paint of his luxury SUV, the symbol of his supposed success, the vehicle that he used to convince the world he was a man of importance. Instead, he would see a heavy rusted tow truck backing into the space. He would see a man in a greasy jumpsuit, securing thick metal chains around the tires of his beloved vehicle. The hydraulic lift would whine loudly as it hoisted the SUV into the air. I could almost see the panic wash over him, the sudden, terrifying realization that the ground was falling out from beneath him. He would scramble for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed the bank, demanding to know what was happening. He would shout, he would threaten, he would try to use his aggressive negotiation tactics. But the voice on the other end of the line would be cold and indifferent. They would tell him the lease was in default. They would tell him the vehicle was being repossessed. He would drop the phone, the reality of his situation finally crushing him. It was not just about the house anymore. It was not just about losing a free place to live. His entire financial survival was evaporating. The illusion he had built, the facade of wealth and success, was crumbling around him. He was a man with no income, massive debt, and no safety net. He was completely, utterly exposed. I thought about Megan. She would wake up to the sound of Tyler shouting. She would see the fear in his eyes. She would realize that the man she married, the man who had promised her the world, was a fraud. She would look around that cheap motel room and understand that this was her new reality. The life of luxury she had taken for granted was gone, locked away behind a titanium deadbolt and severed by a digital freeze. She had stood on my porch and told me I was too needy, that I would just slow them down. She had chosen Tyler's arrogant lies over my quiet sacrifice. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. I felt a pang of sorrow for my daughter, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. The lesson was painful, but it was necessary. She needed to learn the true cost of disrespect and entitlement. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked at the security monitors. The sun was rising, casting a warm, golden light over the manicured lawn of my fortress. The house was safe. My assets were secure. The parasites had been removed. I took a sip of my black coffee. The bitter liquid tasted sweeter than ever. The repo man had done his job. Tyler was stranded in a cheap motel with no car, no money, and no dignity. The financial guillotine had fallen, and the execution was flawless. The morning sun was already warm against the stone patio when I walked outside with my coffee. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine from the trees lining the property. I had spent the last 2 days observing the quiet aftermath of the storm I had unleashed. Tyler and Megan had not returned. The cameras showed only the occasional delivery truck passing by on the main road. I knew Tyler was a desperate man, and desperate men do not simply fade away. They lash out. They look for leverage. They try to find a crack in the armor. I just did not know what form his desperation would take. It was exactly 10 in the morning when the chime of the perimeter alarm echoed through the basement office. I set my mug down and leaned toward the bank of monitors. A plain white sedan, sensible and unassuming, had pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gate. It was not a police cruiser. It was not a delivery vehicle. A woman stepped out. She wore a practical pantsuit and carried a thick leather portfolio. She approached the call box mounted on the stone pillar and pressed the button. I hit the intercom. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "Mr. Sullivan." The woman said, her voice carrying a practiced professional calm. "My name is Agent Sarah Jenkins. I am an investigator with Adult Protective Services. I need to speak with you regarding a report we received." The words hung in the air for a fraction of a second. Adult Protective Services. Tyler had actually done it. He had played the victim card all the way to a state agency. He could not beat me financially, and he could not bully his way past the police, so he was trying to weaponize the system against me. He had called in a report claiming I was a danger to myself. He had painted me as a confused, violent old man who had barricaded himself inside a house he did not understand. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, deep surge of satisfaction. He was walking right into the trap I had spent 40 years building. He thought he was dealing with an emotional father playing a game. He was about to find out he had engaged a man who treated every interaction like a corporate negotiation. "Please come in," I said, pressing the button to open the gate. I walked up the basement stairs and waited by the front door. I smoothed the front of my faded flannel shirt. I did not change into a suit. I did not put on a performance. I wanted her to see exactly what Tyler had described. A simple 66-year-old man in old clothes. When she reached the top of the porch steps, I opened the heavy oak door. "Mr. Sullivan." She began holding out her identification badge. "We received a concerning report. Your son-in-law Tyler contacted our office yesterday. He claims you are suffering from severe undiagnosed dementia. He stated that you violently locked him and your daughter out of your shared home, and that he fears you are a danger to yourself living alone in this large property." I looked at her badge, then met her eyes. She was a professional doing her job. I offered her a warm, easy smile. "I understand, Agent Jenkins. Please come inside. I would be happy to discuss my son-in-law's concerns with you." I led her into the main living room. The house was immaculate. I had spent the last week ensuring every surface was spotless. Every piece of mail was filed, and every room smelled of lemon oil and fresh air. It did not look like the home of a confused, violent old man. It looked like the home of a man who was entirely in control of his environment. She sat on the leather sofa, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the pristine condition of the property. She opened her portfolio and pulled out a notepad. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her tone softening slightly. "These reports are often difficult." Tyler was very specific. He said you have been hiding in the basement for years, completely detached from reality, and that your sudden decision to lock them out was a violent, psychotic break. I sat in the armchair opposite her. I did not interrupt. I let her finish laying out Tyler's entire fabricated narrative. He had played every note of the concerned family member perfectly. He had probably cried on the phone. He had probably told her how much he loved me and how terrified he was for my safety. "Agent Jenkins," I said, leaning forward slightly, "I appreciate your concern, and I respect the job you do. But I am afraid my son-in-law has not been entirely truthful with you regarding his motivations for that phone call." I stood up and walked to the small mahogany table near the entryway. I picked up a thick, bound folder. It was not the financial dossier I had reviewed with Warren. This was a different file prepared specifically for this inevitability. I walked back and handed the folder to her. Inside that folder, I explained calmly, "You will find a comprehensive psychological evaluation. It was conducted by Dr. Harrison, a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist, less than 72 hours ago. It confirms that I am in peak mental acuity. I possess full cognitive function, and I am entirely capable of managing my own affairs." She opened the folder. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the crisp, authoritative medical report. It was an undeniable, legally binding document. It completely shattered Tyler's entire premise. I did not stop there. I pulled a tablet from the side table and brought up the security footage from the day of the Lake Tahoe trip. I handed it to her. "That video," I said, "is the moment my son-in-law claims I suffered a violent psychotic break. I think you will find the reality is quite different." She watched the screen. She saw Tyler blocking my path. She heard him calling me a disgrace, an embarrassment, a charity case. She heard Megan tell me to go back to the basement where I belonged. She saw me smile, turn around, and walk away without raising my voice. Agent Jenkins looked up from the tablet. The professional distance in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, fierce understanding. She had seen cases of elder abuse before. She knew exactly what it looked like when entitled children tried to gaslight their parents out of their assets. "My son-in-law is not concerned for my safety, Agent Jenkins. He is concerned for his own. I locked him out because he is a parasite. And he called you because he is desperate." She closed her portfolio. She handed me back the tablet and the medical file. The evaluation was over. The ambush had failed completely. She closed her portfolio. She handed me back the tablet and the medical file. The evaluation was over. The ambush had failed completely. I reached for the thick manila folder resting on the coffee table. The psychological evaluation and the security footage proved I was of sound mind, but they did not explain the sheer malice behind Tyler's phone call. To understand a predator, you have to follow his hunger. I opened the folder and slid a stack of highlighted bank statements across the glass table toward her. "Agent Jenkins," I said, my voice steady and low. "My son-in-law did not call your office out of a sudden misplaced concern for my cognitive health. He called you because he is drowning. He is a desperate man running out of oxygen, and I am the only life raft he has left." She leaned forward, her professional curiosity piqued. She picked up the first bank statement. I watched her eyes track across the columns of numbers. I explained the origin of the account. I told her how my late wife and I had sacrificed our own luxuries during the early years of our marriage to build a rock-solid safety net for our daughter. It was an account designed to protect Megan from the harsh unpredictability of the world. I pointed to the specific withdrawals Tyler had made over the past 14 months. I walked the investigator through every single transaction. I did not raise my voice. I let the cold, hard data speak for itself. I showed her the thousands of dollars siphoned away to pay for luxury car leases, high-end country club dues, and expensive dinners at exclusive downtown steakhouses. I showed her the exact dates he had withdrawn massive sums of cash to cover the minimum payments on his maxed-out credit cards. I explained that Tyler had convinced my daughter to grant him access to the trust under the guise of investing it into his consulting firm. Instead, he had bled it completely dry to fund the illusion of his success. Agent Jenkins stopped reading and looked up at me. The empathy in her expression had hardened into something much sharper. She was an investigator who spent her days fighting for the vulnerable. She recognized financial abuse when she saw it. She looked back down at the papers, tracing a particularly large withdrawal that had funded the very Lake Tahoe vacation they had banished me from. "He is not just a concerned relative," I continued, leaning back into my armchair. "He is a financial parasite. When I finally cut off his access to my assets and secured my home, his entire false reality collapsed. The luxury vehicle he drives is currently sitting in a repossession lot. His business is entirely insolvent. He called Adult Protective Services, hoping you would declare me a danger to myself, so he could swoop in, assume legal guardianship, and forcefully liquidate this estate to save his own skin. He wanted to use your agency as a weapon to facilitate a robbery." The silence in the living room was profound. Agent Jenkins carefully arranged the bank statements back into a neat pile and placed them inside her leather portfolio. She closed the portfolio with a definitive snap. She did not need to ask any more questions. The narrative was crystal clear. Tyler had tried to manipulate a system designed to protect the elderly, attempting to turn it into an instrument of theft. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice dropping the formal, detached tone she had arrived with, "I have been doing this job for 12 years. We receive calls every day from family members claiming their elderly parents are losing their grip on reality. It is tragically common for children to exaggerate symptoms to gain control of an estate. But the sheer audacity of your son-in-law's fabrication is extraordinary." She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a heavy silver pen. She opened a formal incident report on her clipboard. She wrote a series of swift, decisive notes across the page. I watched her cross out the primary complaint boxes with sharp, heavy strokes. "I am officially closing this investigation," she announced, her pen scratching loudly against the paper. "The report will reflect that the allegations made by your son-in-law are entirely baseless, malicious, and financially motivated. I will attach a copy of the psychological evaluation you provided, along with my own visual assessment of your living conditions. I will also make a specific notation regarding the financial documents you have shared today." She tore a carbon copy of the completed form from her clipboard and handed it across the table to me. I took the paper. It was a formal declaration of my independence and a legal shield against any future attempts Tyler might make to question my sanity. "You need to understand something, Mr. Sullivan," she added, her eyes meeting mine with intense seriousness. "When desperate people lose their leverage, they do not usually just walk away. They escalate. Your son-in-law tried to use the police, and when that failed, he tried to use the state. He has lost his access to your money, his car has been repossessed, and his pride has been publicly shattered. A man like that, backed entirely into a corner with nothing left to lose, is incredibly dangerous. He will try something else. I folded the formal closure document and placed it on the table. I appreciated her warning, but I was not an amateur. I had spent decades in commercial real estate, anticipating the desperate moves of failing competitors. I knew Tyler would try to strike again. I was counting on it. I wanted him to exhaust every single avenue of deceit until he was completely entangled in his own web. "I am well aware, Agent Jenkins," I replied softly. "But I assure you I am entirely prepared for whatever he decides to do next. I built this house and I built the wealth that he is so desperate to steal. He is playing a game he does not have the intellect or the stamina to win." She nodded slowly, a small, respectful smile touching the corners of her mouth. She stood up from the sofa and smoothed her blazer. I stood as well and walked her toward the heavy oak front door. The morning sun poured into the entryway, warming the polished wood floors. "I am sorry you have to deal with this, Mr. Sullivan," she said as I opened the door for her. "No father should have to watch his daughter's husband attempt to destroy him. But I have to say, it is deeply refreshing to meet someone who is so thoroughly equipped to defend themselves. If he attempts to contact our agency again, the call will be immediately flagged and disregarded. You have nothing to fear from us." I shook her hand. Her grip was firm and reassuring. I thanked her for her time and her professionalism. I stood on the porch and watched her walk down the paved path to her unassuming white sedan. The heavy wrought iron gate hummed to life, sliding open to allow her vehicle to exit the property. As the car disappeared down the street, the gate rolled shut, locking into place with a heavy, satisfying thud. I stepped back inside and engaged the titanium deadbolt. The house was quiet again. The ambush had been completely neutralized. Tyler had fired his best shot, trying to brand me as a crazy old man who belonged in a facility. Instead, he had officially cemented my legal and mental autonomy on a state record. He had handed me the exact documentation I needed to prove my competency in any future legal battle. He was blindly thrashing in the dark, and with every panicked swing, he was only tightening the noose around his own neck. I walked back down to my basement office and poured another cup of coffee. The board was set. The pieces were moving. Now I just had to wait for him to make his final fatal mistake. The afternoon rain began to fall against the basement windows, blurring the sunlight into a dull gray haze. I sat at my heavy oak desk, nursing a fresh cup of coffee and listening to the rhythmic drumming of the water against the glass. The house was a fortress of absolute quiet. I had spent the morning neutralizing the state investigator, and I was finally allowing myself a moment to simply breathe. Tyler had exhausted his conventional options. He had no money and no access to the property. I knew he was pacing the floor of whatever cheap motel room he had managed to secure, trying to figure out how to survive. The vibration of my cell phone broke the silence. I glanced at the screen and saw the name of my lawyer, Warren, flashing brightly. Warren was not a man who called with trivial updates. We had established a strict protocol for communication. If he was calling me directly outside of our scheduled strategy sessions, it meant the landscape had shifted. I picked up the device and answered with a simple greeting. Warren did not waste time with pleasantries. His tone was sharp and stripped of its usual measured calm. He told me that the digital tripwires we placed on my assets had just been triggered. When we first initiated the lockout, Warren had placed a high-level security freeze on the title of the house and all associated commercial properties under my holding company. It was an alert system designed to notify his office the second anyone attempted to query the deed or run a background check against the physical address. Warren explained that an inquiry had just come through. It was not from a traditional banking institution or a recognizable mortgage lender. The query originated from a boutique private lending firm downtown. These were hard money lenders. They catered to desperate clients who needed massive infusions of cash immediately and who usually possessed terrible credit histories. They charged astronomical interest rates and required ironclad physical collateral to secure their risky loans. Tyler had walked into their office seeking a $200,000 business loan to save his failing consulting firm. Warren paused, letting the gravity of the number settle in the quiet space between us. $200,000 was a staggering amount for a man whose only current asset was a collection of maxed-out credit cards and a storage unit full of designer suits. I asked Warren how a man with absolutely no verifiable income and a completely ruined credit score could even get a meeting with a private lender for that kind of money. The answer Warren provided made my blood run completely cold. Tyler was using my house as collateral. I leaned forward in my leather chair. I asked my lawyer how that was even legally possible, considering the property was securely locked inside my holding company. Warren explained that Tyler had submitted a highly detailed legal document to the private lender. It was a quitclaim deed. The document explicitly stated that I had formally transferred the entire ownership of the suburban estate over to Tyler and my daughter Megan. The reality of the situation hit me with the force of a physical blow. Tyler had not just fabricated a story about my mental health. He had gone into the darkest corners of desperation and committed outright forgery. Warren told me that his investigators had managed to get a digital copy of the fraudulent deed from a contact inside the lending firm. The document featured my exact signature perfectly traced and replicated at the bottom of the page. It even included a counterfeit notary seal to make it look entirely legitimate to the private brokers. I sat in the silence of my basement office processing the sheer audacity of my son-in-law. He had crossed a massive invisible line. He was no longer just an entitled parasite trying to live rent-free in my home. He was no longer just an arrogant child throwing a tantrum on my driveway. By forging my signature on a legal property transfer and presenting it to a financial institution, he had committed a major federal felony. He was engaging in severe wire fraud and grand larceny. I wondered briefly if Megan knew about the forged deed. I wondered if she had sat in that cheap motel room and watched her husband trace my signature onto a fraudulent document. If she was a willing participant in the theft of my estate, then she was truly lost to me. But if Tyler was acting entirely alone, hiding his felony from his own wife to save his fragile ego, then he was even more dangerous than I had originally calculated. Either way, the consequences were going to be absolute and permanent. Warren warned me that we needed to contact the authorities immediately. He wanted to call the district attorney and have the private lender halt the loan process before any funds were accidentally dispersed. He explained that if the loan went through, we would have to untangle a massive legal mess to clear the title of my house. Warren was a cautious man who preferred to eliminate risks the moment they appeared. I looked at the security monitors glowing in the dim light of my office. I thought about the way Tyler had looked at me when he told me I was a disgrace. I thought about the casual cruelty in his voice when he tried to erase my existence to impress his imaginary clients. I told Warren to stop everything. I explicitly ordered my lawyer not to contact the police and not to warn the private lending firm. Warren was stunned. He asked me if I fully understood the risk I was taking by letting a fraudulent loan application proceed. I told him I understood it perfectly. If we stopped the process now, Tyler would simply claim it was a misunderstanding. He would lie and say he thought he had permission, or he would blame some phantom third party for the forged document. He was a master at slipping out of tight spaces by manipulating the narrative. I did not want him to slip away. I wanted him to commit to the crime with absolutely no avenue of escape. I told Warren that for the fraud to be completely inescapable, Tyler needed to walk into that lending office and sign the final closing documents in person. He needed to put his own pen to the paper and formally accept the fraudulent funds under the watchful eyes of the lenders. I instructed my lawyer to find out the exact date and time of the closing meeting. I wanted to know what floor the office was on and how many exits were in the building. I was going to let Tyler build his own gallows and weave his own rope. I was going to let him believe he had finally outsmarted the old man in the basement. We ended the call with a new plan in place. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the rain tapping against the glass. The final act was set, and I was ready to watch his entire world fall apart. Warren did not speak for a long time after I gave him my instructions. The silence stretched across the digital connection, heavy and thick with disbelief. I could hear the faint hum of his office air conditioning in the background. Warren was a man who had spent his entire career mitigating risk, avoiding exposure, and shutting down liabilities the second they appeared. My order went against every professional instinct he possessed. He finally found his voice and asked me if I fully comprehended the magnitude of what I was asking him to do. I told him I understood it perfectly. I explained that if we called the district attorney right now, if we sent a cease and desist letter to the private lending firm, Tyler would simply back away. He would play the victim. He would claim it was a terrible misunderstanding, a clerical error, or that he had been manipulated by a rogue mortgage broker. He would slip right through the fingers of the justice system because the crime had not yet been fully consummated. Tyler was a slippery, arrogant man who had spent his entire life talking his way out of consequences. I was not going to give him the opportunity to talk his way out of this. I wanted the crime committed in permanent ink. I wanted him to sit in a leather chair in a room full of witnesses and sign his own name next to my forged signature. I wanted the transaction to cross the threshold from attempted fraud to a fully executed federal felony. Warren sighed heavily. He warned me that allowing a fraudulent loan to close against my property could entangle my estate in months of complex litigation. The lenders would place a lien on the house. We would have to file massive amounts of paperwork to prove the transaction was invalid. I told Warren I did not care about the paperwork. I did not care about the temporary legal mess. I had enough liquid capital to bury that boutique lending firm in litigation for the next decade if they decided to fight me. What I cared about was absolute finality. I wanted Tyler locked in a cage he built with his own 2 hands. I heard the sound of Warren typing on his keyboard. He knew better than to argue with me when my mind was set. He asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told him I needed complete logistical dominance over the closing meeting. I instructed his investigators to find out the exact date and time Tyler was scheduled to sign the final loan documents. I needed to know the physical layout of the private lender's office. I wanted to know what floor they were on, how many elevators serviced the lobby, and whether there was a secondary exit Tyler could use to escape. Warren promised to have a full tactical briefing ready for me by the following morning. We ended the call. I sat back in my chair and stared at the rain washing over the basement windows. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. I spent the rest of the week in a state of hyper-focused calm. I did not leave the house. I did not answer any calls from unknown numbers. I watched the security feeds with detached interest. Tyler and Megan remained completely absent from the property. They were likely holed up in that cheap motel, surviving on whatever scraps of cash they had left, while Tyler waited for his miraculous payday. He probably told Megan that he was closing a massive consulting deal that would solve all their problems. He was feeding her false hope while he marched them both toward absolute ruin. I wondered if my daughter knew the truth. I wondered if she had watched him forge my signature on the quitclaim deed. I hoped for her sake that she was entirely ignorant. If she was a willing participant in the theft of my legacy, then the remaining shred of my paternal affection would be completely extinguished. But I had to proceed under the assumption that Tyler was acting alone, driven by his own fragile ego and toxic desperation. He was a man who needed to feel superior, and he was willing to risk federal prison to maintain that illusion. By Friday morning, Warren sent a secure encrypted file to my inbox. It contained everything I had asked for and more. The closing meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at exactly 2 p.m. The private lending firm operated out of a mid-rise building on the edge of the financial district. They occupied a suite on the 7th floor. The floor plan Warren provided showed a single main entrance with a reception area and a large glass-walled conference room where the signing would take place. There were no back doors. There was no fire escape accessible from the conference room. It was a perfect dead end. Warren also confirmed that he had reached out to a contact he had inside the Economic Crimes Division of the local police department. He had presented the preliminary evidence of the forgery without naming the target and secured a commitment that 2 plainclothes detectives would accompany us to the meeting. They would wait in the wings ready to execute the arrest the moment the ink dried on the fraudulent loan documents. I printed the floor plan and laid it flat on my desk. I traced the route Tyler would take from the elevator to the conference room. I imagined him walking into that office feeling an overwhelming sense of triumph. He would sit down in a comfortable chair, believing he had finally outsmarted the quiet old man he had so casually discarded. He would believe that the $200,000 was about to hit his empty bank account, saving his fake business and rescuing his pride. I was going to let him taste that victory. I was going to let him hold it in his hands for a fraction of a second before I ripped it entirely away. The setup was complete. The trap was baited, and the jaws were locked open. I folded the blueprints and placed them into my leather briefcase. All I had to do now was wait for Tuesday afternoon to arrive. Tuesday afternoon arrived with a heavy, suffocating heat that blanketed the financial district. I stood in the polished marble lobby of the 7th floor, watching the digital numbers on the elevator panel drop. Warren stood to my left, holding a sleek leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of my son-in-law. To my right stood Detectives Miller and Vance. They wore sharp, unassuming suits blending perfectly into the corporate environment, but their posture carried the unmistakable weight of law enforcement. We did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The plan had been meticulously outlined and every variable accounted for. The receptionist at the front desk barely glanced up from her computer screen as we bypassed the waiting area and walked down the carpeted hallway. Warren had already coordinated with the building management to ensure our uninterrupted access to the outer corridor. We stopped just outside the main conference room. The walls were made of thick frosted glass, completely soundproofed, but transparent enough in the center to offer a perfect view of the proceedings inside. I stepped close to the glass and looked through the clear horizontal stripe. Tyler was sitting in a heavy ergonomic chair at the far end of a long mahogany table. He was wearing a tailored navy blue suit that I knew he had purchased using the funds drained from my daughter's trust account. He looked incredibly tense, leaning forward, with his elbows resting on the polished wood. Across the table sat a loan officer, a slick-looking man wearing a flashy gold watch and a predatory smile. Between them sat a stack of legal documents thicker than a telephone directory. This was the boutique lending firm that specialized in desperate clients. They did not care about Tyler and his fake consulting business. They only cared about the massive suburban estate he was falsely claiming as collateral. I watched Tyler pick up a silver pen. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. This was the moment of absolute irreversibility. He was not just acting like a spoiled child anymore. He was actively engaging in a massive federal felony. The loan officer tapped a specific line on the top page and slid it closer to Tyler. I watched my son-in-law hesitate for a fraction of a second. He looked down at the paper. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he was forging my signature and pledging a house he did not own to save his own fragile ego. He took a deep breath, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and pressed the tip of the pen against the paper. I watched his hand move across the dotted line. He signed the first page. Then he flipped to the next and signed again. He was tracing my name, stealing my identity in real time. The detectives standing next to me shifted their weight, ready to move. I raised a hand, signaling them to wait. I wanted Tyler to sign every single page. I wanted the fraud to be so thoroughly executed that no high-priced defense attorney could ever claim he simply made a clerical error. Tyler continued to sign. He moved through the stack of documents with increasing speed, his initial hesitation completely vanishing. He was feeding off his own arrogance, believing he had pulled off the ultimate deception. He thought he was walking out of this building with $200,000 in liquid capital. He thought he had outsmarted the quiet old man in the basement. He flipped to the final page, the notarized quitclaim deed. He signed it with a dramatic flourish and handed the pen back to the loan officer. The broker smiled broadly and extended his hand across the table. Tyler took it, shaking it vigorously, his chest puffed out with imaginary triumph. I looked at Detective Miller and gave a single sharp nod. I reached out and grasped the heavy stainless steel handle of the conference room door. I did not knock. I did not announce myself. I pushed the door open with enough force that it hit the rubber wall stopper with a loud echoing thud. The sudden noise shattered the quiet professional atmosphere of the room. The loan officer jumped in his seat, snatching his hand back from Tyler. He looked up at us, his expression twisting into immediate outrage. He opened his mouth to demand what we were doing, interrupting a private financial closing. Tyler did not look up immediately. He was still staring at the signed documents, a smug, satisfied grin plastered across his sunburned face. He slowly turned his head to see who had dared to interrupt his moment of victory. When his eyes met mine, the physical transformation was extraordinary. It was as if the gravity in the room had suddenly quadrupled, crushing him into the expensive leather chair. The smug grin vanished entirely, washed away by a wave of absolute, unadulterated terror. All the color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His mouth opened slightly, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. He looked at me, then at Warren, and finally at the two men standing behind us with their hands resting casually near their belts. "Good afternoon, Tyler," I said. My voice was calm, deep, and carried no trace of anger. I stepped fully into the room, allowing the heavy glass door to swing shut behind me. The loan officer stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He pointed a finger at me and demanded that we leave the premises immediately or he would call building security. Warren stepped forward smoothly, interposing himself between me and the angry broker. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp manila folder, placing it directly on top of the freshly signed loan documents. "I would strongly advise against calling your security," Warren said to the loan officer, his tone clipped and strictly professional. "My name is Warren Fisher, and I represent Mr. Jim Sullivan, the sole legal owner of the property your client just attempted to leverage. The documents you are holding contain a forged signature on a fraudulent quitclaim deed. You are currently in possession of evidence related to a major felony." The loan officer froze, looking down at the paperwork, and then back up at Warren. His predatory confidence evaporated instantly, replaced by the cautious self-preservation of a man who suddenly realized he was standing in the middle of a massive federal crime scene. Tyler finally found his voice. It was a weak, pathetic squeak, completely devoid of its usual arrogant resonance. "Jim," he stammered, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he pressed them flat against the mahogany table. "Jim, what are you doing here? This is a misunderstanding. We were just exploring some equity options." I walked slowly around the edge of the large table, stopping just a few feet away from where he sat. I looked down at the man who had called me an embarrassment, who had treated my daughter like a bank account, who had tried to discard me from my own home. "There is no misunderstanding, Tyler," I said softly, maintaining steady, unbroken eye contact. "You did not explore equity options. You committed grand larceny. You committed wire fraud. You sat in that chair and forged my name because you are a desperate, failing man who refuses to live in reality." Tyler frantically shook his head, trying to stand up, but his legs seemed incapable of supporting his weight. He slumped back down, gripping the armrests of his chair. He looked at the loan officer, pleading with his eyes, but the broker had already taken 3 large steps away from the table, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the radioactive mess sitting in front of him. Tyler turned back to me, his eyes wide and shining with panicked tears. "Jim, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Do not do this. I can fix this. I can tear these papers up right now. We can walk away. I will never bother you again. Please, you cannot ruin my life over this." I leaned forward, resting my knuckles on the polished wood. "You ruined your own life, Tyler," I replied. "You locked me out. You drained my daughter's safety net. You called Adult Protective Services and tried to brand me as a lunatic. You forged my signature to steal my home. I am not ruining you. I am simply allowing the consequences of your own arrogant actions to finally catch up to you." I stood up straight and took a step back. I looked toward the door and gave a slight nod. Detectives Miller and Vance moved forward with swift, practiced efficiency, They bypassed Warren and approached Tyler. Detective Miller pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clinking sound filled the quiet conference room, ringing louder than a church bell. Tyler began to sob, a wet, pathetic sound echoing from the back of his throat. He raised his hands in a defensive gesture, completely surrendering to the inevitable. Detective Miller instructed him to stand up and place his hands behind his back. Tyler complied, his entire body trembling violently as the detective secured the steel cuffs around his wrists. The harsh ratcheting sound of the metal locking into place was the most satisfying noise I had heard in 4 years. The detective read him his rights, the legal phrasing cutting through Tyler, sobbing like a surgical scalpel. I watched them march him toward the glass door. He looked back at me over his shoulder, his face streaked with tears, his expensive suit wrinkled and ruined. He was no longer the arrogant king of my suburban estate. He was just a pathetic, terrified criminal being led away in chains. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the elevator doors close, sealing his fate. The financial execution was complete. I stepped up to the massive mahogany table. The room was perfectly silent, except for the heavy, ragged breathing coming from my son-in-law. Tyler was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the original property deed to my estate. It was printed on heavy ivory paper, bearing the authentic raised seal of the county clerk. I placed it gently directly over the fraudulent document Tyler had just signed. The loan officer leaned forward, squinting at the genuine paperwork. His flashy gold watch caught the light from the overhead fixtures as he reached out to touch the heavy ivory paper. He read the name of my holding company and the date of the original trust formation. He looked from the authentic seal back down to the fake notary stamp on the forged quitclaim deed. The broker pulled his hand back quickly. He pushed his leather chair away from the table, putting as much physical distance as possible between himself and the fraudulent transaction. He realized he had just spent the last hour facilitating a massive federal crime. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to yell to command the room. I looked down at Tyler and began to dismantle his entire existence piece by piece. I opened a second folder and laid out the financial records Warren had prepared. I placed the bank statements side by side on the polished wood. The first stack showed the joint trust account I had built for my daughter Megan. I pointed to the long list of unauthorized withdrawals Tyler had made over the last 14 months. I explained to the loan officer and the detectives exactly how my son-in-law had been siphoning thousands of dollars to pay for imported wine, luxury suits, and expensive steakhouse dinners. Tyler squeezed his eyes shut and shook his head. He begged me to stop talking, but his voice was barely a whisper. He knew the illusion he had spent years crafting was evaporating in front of an audience. I placed another stack of papers on the table. These were the credit reports detailing the staggering amount of commercial debt he had hidden from his own wife. I showed the room how he had leveraged predatory loans to maintain the facade of a successful consulting firm. I laid out the cancellation notice for the luxury sport utility vehicle that had been repossessed from the cheap motel parking lot just days ago. I laid out the final 30-day eviction notice that had permanently locked him out of my suburban fortress. I wanted the detectives to see the full scope of his parasitic desperation. The loan officer stood up and backed away toward the far wall of the conference room. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He stammered an apology, stating his firm had absolutely no prior knowledge of the deception. He promised to cooperate fully with any federal investigation. He was scrambling to save his own career and his own reputation while throwing Tyler completely under the bus. Tyler looked at the broker with absolute panic. He realized his last remaining ally in the room had just turned into a star witness for the prosecution. He turned his attention back to me. The arrogance that had defined his entire personality was gone. It was replaced by a pathetic, desperate groveling that made my stomach turn. He slid out of his ergonomic chair and fell to his knees on the carpeted floor. He clasped his hands together and looked up at me with tears streaming down his sunburned face. He begged for mercy. He pleaded with me to think about my daughter. He swore he was going to use the loan money to fix everything and pay me back with interest. He promised he would sign a full confession, he would go to rehab for his spending, he would do whatever I demanded if I just told the detectives to leave the room. He told me he was a good man who had simply made a few terrible mistakes under immense pressure. He tried to manipulate my paternal instincts, using Megan as a human shield to block the consequences of his own greed. I looked down at him kneeling on the floor. I felt no pity. I felt no compassion. I felt nothing but a cold, sterile satisfaction. I told him he was not a good man who made mistakes. I told him he was a calculated predator who had finally run out of victims. I reminded him of the morning he stood in my driveway, blocking my path to the family vacation. I reminded him of the way he had looked at my faded flannel shirt and called me a disgrace to the family image. I told him that true wealth was not measured by leased vehicles or fake consulting firms. True wealth was patience, strategy, and the power to absolutely crush anyone foolish enough to steal from a quiet man. I took a step back and looked at the two detectives standing near the frosted glass door. I gave them a slight nod, indicating that I was finished. Detective Miller stepped forward. He reached down and grabbed Tyler by the shoulder of his expensive navy blue suit, hauling him roughly to his feet. Tyler struggled weakly, sobbing and pleading for one more chance, but the detective was unrelenting. He spun Tyler around and forced his arms behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly into place, biting into his wrists. Detective Vance stood nearby, holding a digital voice recorder, capturing every single pathetic excuse and tearful confession spilling from my son-in-law. "You are under arrest." Detective Miller stated, his voice calm and authoritative. He recited the Miranda rights, reading them slowly and clearly over the sound of Tyler weeping. The charges were listed one by one, echoing off the glass walls of the conference room. Felony wire fraud, grand larceny, forgery of a legal document, identity theft. Each charge carried a significant mandatory sentence in a federal penitentiary. Tyler was looking at a decade behind bars and absolute financial ruin. Warren stepped forward and methodically gathered the original property deed and the financial dossiers, returning them to his leather briefcase. He left the fraudulent loan documents and the forged quitclaim deed on the mahogany table for the police to collect as official evidence. Warren looked at the terrified loan officer and instructed him to secure the room until the crime scene investigators arrived. The broker nodded frantically, agreeing to whatever my lawyer demanded. Detective Miller gripped Tyler by the arm and marched him toward the door. As they passed me, Tyler stopped struggling. He hung his head, his chin resting against his chest, defeated and broken. He did not look at me again. He knew it was over. The execution had been flawless. The trap had sprung shut, and he was caught securely inside it. I followed them out of the conference room and walked down the carpeted hallway of the lending firm. The reception area was completely silent. The staff stared in shock as the arrogant man who had walked in expecting $200,000 was paraded out in steel chains. We reached the elevator bank and the doors slid open. I stepped inside with Warren while the detectives led Tyler into a separate car designated for the authorities. The doors closed, cutting off my view of his tear-stained face. The elevator descended smoothly toward the lobby. I felt a profound sense of closure settle over my shoulders. The parasitic infection had been successfully removed from my estate. The man who had tried to erase me from my own life was now facing the absolute destruction of his own. But the war was not entirely over. There was still one final piece of business left to handle. I knew my daughter Megan would already be receiving the frantic phone calls from the police precinct. I knew she would be waiting for me, expecting me to save her husband from the nightmare he had created. I tightened my grip on my briefcase, preparing myself for the final reckoning. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct hummed with a sterile, annoying buzz. The air smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I sat on a hard wooden bench in the waiting area, holding my briefcase across my lap. I knew it would not take long. Less than an hour after the elevator doors closed on Tyler, my cell phone lit up with a frantic call from Megan. I had simply told her where I was and waited. The heavy glass doors of the precinct flew open. Megan rushed inside, looking completely frantic. Her hair was a mess and she was wearing the same clothes she had on when I locked them out of the house. Her eyes were swollen red and darting around the room until they locked onto me. She ran across the scuffed linoleum floor and collapsed onto the bench beside me. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flannel shirt. "Dad, you have to stop this," she pleaded, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "You have to tell them to let him go. They are talking about federal charges and prison time. Please, Dad, he just made a mistake. He was stressed about his business. He was just trying to provide for us. You have the money. You can drop the charges and make this all go away." I looked down at the hands gripping my arm. Then I looked into my daughter's eyes. I searched her face, looking for the innocent little girl I had raised, the girl I had protected from every harsh reality of the world. But she was not there anymore. The woman sitting next to me was a stranger. She was a woman who had stood on my driveway and watched her husband humiliate me. She was a woman who had told her own father that he was a needy burden and commanded him to go hide in a basement so he would not embarrass her in front of imaginary friends. "He did not make a mistake, Megan," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of the comfort she was desperately seeking. "A mistake is forgetting to pay a utility bill. Forging my signature on a legal document to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars is a calculated felony. He stole from me. And more importantly, he stole from you. He drained the emergency trust fund your mother and I built for your future, just to buy tailored suits and imported wine." She flinched, pulling her hands back, as if I had burned her. She shook her head side to side, refusing to accept the reality of the man she had married. "But we are family." "Dad," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You cannot just abandon family." "I did not abandon you, Megan," I replied, feeling a profound, heavy sadness settle deep in my chest. "You abandoned me. When he called me a disgrace, you looked the other way. You chose his arrogant lies over my quiet love. You chose the illusion of wealth over the father who would have given you his last breath." I stood up from the hard wooden bench, smoothing the front of my shirt. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic, finally realizing that I was not going to write a check to save her. "I am not dropping the charges, and I am not paying his bail," I told her. "The real world has consequences, Megan. It is time you finally learned how to survive in it." I turned my back on her sobbing pleas and walked out of the precinct, stepping into the cool evening air. 6 months have passed since the heavy glass doors of the police precinct closed behind me. The harsh and bitter winter slowly gave way to a bright and steady spring, bringing a profound sense of renewal to the entire property. I sit on my back porch now, letting the morning sun warm my face. A steaming mug of black coffee rests in my hands. The sprawling lawn stretches out before me, perfectly manicured and vibrantly green. There are no expensive luxury vehicles parked inappropriately in the driveway. There are no loud, arrogant voices echoing from the upper windows, disrupting the morning calm. The house is completely and wonderfully silent. The legal proceedings moved with incredible speed once the federal prosecutors took over the case. Tyler could not manipulate his way out of a courtroom filled with undeniable physical evidence and his own recorded, tearful confessions. He took a desperate plea deal, hoping for a lighter sentence, but the federal judge was not swayed by his pathetic tears or his fabricated remorse. He is currently serving a significant sentence in a federal correctional facility. The custom designer suits and imported gold watches have been permanently replaced by a standard issue uniform. The man who once stood on my driveway and called me a disgrace is now simply a number in a heavily guarded system. I do not think about him often. He is a closed chapter, an infection successfully removed from the host. Megan did not reach out to me again after that terrible night at the police station. The harsh reality of her situation forced her to finally wake up from the arrogant dream she had been living. Without my secret financial support, and without Tyler pulling the strings, she had to face the world completely on her own. My lawyer Warren keeps tabs on her from a respectful distance just to ensure she is physically safe. She moved into a small, cramped apartment located just a few blocks from the storage unit where we locked away the useless remnants of her fake life. She took an entry-level job working the front desk at a local dental clinic. For the first time in her adult life, my daughter is learning the true value of a single dollar. She is learning exactly how many hours of hard, honest labor it takes to pay for basic groceries and keep the lights on. It is a painful education, but it is the exact medicine she needs to cure the toxic entitlement that almost destroyed her. Perhaps one day, when she has truly learned how to stand on her own 2 feet, she will find the courage to walk up my driveway and offer a genuine apology. The heavy iron gate will always open for a daughter who remembers how to respect her father. Until then, I am perfectly content with my solitude. I take a slow, warm sip of my coffee and listen to the gentle rustling of the wind through the tall oak trees. The immense, suffocating weight I carried for 4 years has been entirely lifted from my shoulders. My commercial properties continue to thrive, and my financial legacy remains completely secure. I am alone, yes, but it is not a lonely existence. It is the deep, unshakable peace of a man who finally reclaimed his home, his dignity, and his absolute independence. The most profound lesson woven through Jim's journey is that true wealth is not measured by the luxury vehicles in your driveway or the designer labels on your back, but by the integrity of your character. Tyler and Megan allowed greed and superficiality to blind them to the value of family, mistaking Jim's quiet, unassuming humility for weakness. They learned the hard way that entitlement is a fragile glass house easily shattered by reality. Ultimately, respect is a currency that cannot be forged, and those who treat their loved ones as disposable burdens will eventually find themselves standing alone in the ruins of their own arrogance. If this story of silent justice resonated with you, hit the like button, subscribe for more incredible life lessons, and let me know in the comments how you would have handled Tyler's ultimate disrespect.